Hi, this is Machiavelli, and I'm older than the esports historian here on Thorin's YouTube channel.
The Quake franchise, particularly in the duel 1v1 format, has been heavily influenced by strong duel players from Russia. Often people say CIS so that they can count in Cypher, who is from Belarus, a former USSR country and member of the Commonwealth of Independent States, because he's arguably the best duel player ever. But we can just narrow it down to Russia for the purposes of this video on this particular context. Now, obviously, the first name people are going to think of is Cooler, one of the Mount Rushmore faces of Quake Duel. And fans in the 2010s are also going to be starting to think of, obviously, the fondly remembering the late arrival to championship level form of the powerhouse Evil, who was close to championships a number of times and was one of the few top players who could actually beat most of the big four of Cypher, Rafa, Cooler and Avec. But it was actually their arrival in the early 2000s to Quake Duel, which was both a shock and massively significant to Duel's history across Quake 3, Quake 4, Quake Live, and now even into Quake Champions. In the days before the Russians were even part of the competitive landscape or relevant, the best players were all from Sweden. If we're talking about Europe, we're talking about like Lexa, who'd be the best Quake World duel player, Blue, who was a fantastic talent from Quake 2, Duma, who'd been one of the best Quake World players, All-Stars, basically the Clan 9 guys. These were the best players. Or if you were in NA and you followed that scene, since they so rarely ever met the top Europeans in Quake and Quake 2. Obviously, you thought of like Machiavelli coming from Quake 2. Maybe in the early days, you looked at some of the talents like 04 or C3 were kind of rising up and had some talent, but they hadn't quite made it to the top yet. Now, one of the reasons why we never really had cross-Atlantic play very much back then was obviously like, we didn't have the LANs, so there was no LAN circuit. There weren't really big world championships. Those weren't really a thing, at least not approaching the basic context of a tier 1 international LAN at any point in time in the last 19 or 20 years. And then if you had to play online, the ping was too much to make the results actually seem legitimate. So nobody really counted them, and you kind of just competed off in your own scene. So the problem was you had Europe, you had North America, you had the wars between who's better on forums, etc. And people would argue, could the best EU player beat the best NA player? And same with teams in Team Deathmatch. But that's about it. No one cared about any other part of the world, and definitely nobody cared particularly about Russia. I mean, they were just some weird part off over here. And obviously esports itself hadn't developed yet, so we didn't know how much talent there was there and how many potential future greats in esports would come from the Russian region. So the first big major of Quake 3 was before the Russians were ever involved. It was the Razer CPL in April of 2000. It was won by Fatality, most famously. He went on to obviously become a top professional, a massively prolific player, won many championships for many, many more years. 0 Russians attended or featured in the top 32 of this tournament, the first like world championship of Quake 3. Fatality himself, basically, from this period before and on, was the king of Quake. I mean, Lexa later would battle him for that title, WCGC onwards, etc., because he'd been Europe's best in theory. He just hadn't performed very well at Razer CPL. So we'd heard some stories of like these top Russian players, Pele and Pelosity, particularly, and their POV demos did look impressive. Their style was so aggressive. So there was like some underground hype on the main Quake fan sites at the time, like XS Reality, now obviously ES Reality. It was actually in TDM, Team Deathmatch 4v4, where the Russians first had their impact. Like the first Eurocup, they were relevant. They weren't there at the LAN finals. Then there was people forget about this, the Barry's World Eurocup, which was like a national team tournament that took place on LAN. I think it was even in London. And at this tournament, Team Russia won the tournament. And Team Russia was Pelosity, who you'll hear later in the story, Satan, not someone you're going to hear about, Devil, who you're also not going to hear about, and then Power. These were the players, basically the players who were known as Formosa when they played in traditional Eurocups in the future and were very competitive with the absolute best teams, even famously finishing second to the Germans of Slinger and Stellam and Neok and those guys. So, and later on, Cyberfight was obviously Power's team later on when they split from Pelosity. I think it was when they split from Pelosity. I can't remember on that one. That was Forza I'm thinking of. It was Cyberfight in the middle and then and then Forza later. There we go. Obviously a name someone might know from Counter-Strike and other games at this point in time. The World Cyber Games champions, when it did happen, which was, if you remember, in the late 2000s, it was like the precursor to the World Cyber Games, but essentially was like a World Cyber Games. You went to Korea, etc. Had this massive international flair. It was kind of like the Olympics. Again, we had no attendance by Russian talent, and that's despite so many countries being invited and represented. You had like Japan there, Korea, China, Mexico. These weren't even relevant countries, except vaguely Korea, because PowerCade had a good finish, top 3 at the Razer CPL earlier in the year. So the idea there was no Russians in attendance, there was no even like sort of framework to get them in, shows you how underdeveloped esports was at the time. This tournament was won by Fatality, who was still the best player. Lakerman was second. He was the main rival to Fatality. And then he had 0-4 in third, the second best American by this point in time, who hadn't quite come through to the form which would allow him to become a champion later in the year at Babbage's, and obviously eventually the best North American player the next year. So the arrival of the Russians in Duel, interestingly, came at the end of 2000. In December of 2000 was CPL Cologne. This was the first European CPL, so it had a smaller prize pool than the big North American CPLs, which were more like World Championships. But it gathered together most of the top European duelers, at least the ones who could attend and had sponsorship, with the exception, in terms of having top players, that you had Fatality there also, the best American player and in theory the best player in the world, because he was trying to be a full professional in the modern sense. He was going on the whole circuit around the world. He would even later go to like Asia for tournaments. This guy was really trying to be a top pro, and he had the sponsorship and the backing to do it crucially, and was practicing all year round. So this event was won by Fatality, which isn't a shock, but the revelation of the event was the sudden en masse display of Russian power in Quake Duel. Because in second place was the aforementioned Puyallup, and he looked amazing in doing so. He beat Lakerman, one of the consensus best players in the world at this point in time. He was just finished second at WCGC. He managed to get within a single frag, basically one mistake, from beating Fatality in both the upper bracket, and was very close on T2, basically Pulassity's map, in the final of the event, and could potentially have won this event if he'd have maybe had more tenure playing internationally and wasn't playing at this time a seasoned pro. Then, beyond even just Pulassity, this is what I'm saying about the Russians really just barging their way in the door. Then you had a player called Power, Pulassity's Formosa teammate, and who'd won that Barry's World Eurocup in TDM. He finished in fourth, so ahead of tons and tons of very good Quake players and professionals. And then you also had, and he'd lost to Pulassity twice. That's the only person who'd beaten him in the tournament format. We never would have known what had happened if he'd have played Lakerman or Fatality or something, because in the upper bracket he lost to Pulassity, and then he went on an epic lower bracket run, beating loads of the top German players who were in those like Ancient/SK teams, before losing a second time to Pulassity, who then went on and went to the final later, obviously. I believe, this is all from memory, some of it, except for some of the placings. I even believe there was some story back then, some anecdote, that in an interview, Power even said, because he was teammates with Pulassity and practiced with Pulassity, since he knew Pulassity was better than him, he'd actually, I think in the second match in the lower bracket, let Pulassity just win the game. I think he might have even given him a forfeit win or something crazy, because he said Pulassity just had the better chance to go against Fatality and potentially win the event. So at the time, that was actually very controversial, since he was admittedly sort of through the game. But I thought that was actually kind of cool in its own right. I mean, I wouldn't do it personally. I think competitors should always try and be the best and just do what they can to win. If you can beat a guy who's better than you, so what? It's not about national pride. But in a way, as a team aspect, that's kind of cool that he wanted to give his teammate, who he knew had practiced a load and was now at his first big international event, a chance to potentially go win the championship and show he was the best player in Europe. So kind of cool. After that, we had the XSI2, branded as the AMD Cup. So the XS Invitational had been the tournament, if you remember, in early 2000, I think it was, that Fatality had gone to, which had all these great Quake 2 and Quake World legends invited, and then Fatality and a couple of others. And Fatality had won it without losing a map and already established himself as like, this guy's going to be the dominant player. And it wasn't long after that he won the Razer CPL. So when they had this tournament, unlike the first XSI where you just played everyone, in this one it was actually set up as a quite unique Europe versus North America format, where it was almost like a Ryder Cup approach. And on the Europe side, listen, remember, American side has like Fatality. It didn't actually have 0-4 this time. It wasn't the best player, but it had some other very good players. Wombat, I think maybe Revenant even, like a whole bunch of the top duelers from America. It was actually Europe who was dominant in this one, because Lakerman and Pulassity, from memory, were the only players to win every single game at the tournament. And if anything, it showed a lot, because Yeah, great Lakerman. So when there's no actual like pressure, it's not a really big land championship of 1v1. You can beat everyone then, but you can't in the normal tournaments because he was obviously had some sort of psychological problem against Fatality in the finals. And then Pulacity just showed he was an absolute monster again. And in this tournament, he even played Fatality. He got the game on T2, his map, and he smashed this guy. Remember, that's a map you could have grind out like, 5-4 wins on. I think he won something like 27-10 or something crazy. He just absolutely dominated him. And admittedly though, Fatality had already started at this point in time to look towards some other games, but let's not put that past at this point in time. He was still definitely a top professional Quake player. Now, CPL Holland, the next European CPL, was in May of 2001. 04 had won the Babbage's CPL at the end of 2000, so Fatality was actually coming to this European CPL again as a professional, but also, quite frankly, hoping to pick up some small sort of circuit wins to make his case for being number one in the world again. Like, he'd already gone to the CPL Pacific event trying to do that. He just didn't win it. It was actually Blue, one of my favourite players at the time, who shockingly beat him in the final. A guy who's a big what-if player, quite frankly. Then you had this amazing upset. So Pulacity had come close to beating Fatality, but he hadn't closed the deal. A Russian player won CPL Holland, but it wasn't Pulacity, it wasn't Power, it wasn't any of the names I mentioned before, Pele, etc. It was a nobody. It was B100 Death from Team B100. He lost to Fatality in the upper bracket, but then Lakerman beat Fatality, so everyone's like, oh my god, this is going to be amazing. Lakerman finally beat Fatality. It's Lakerman's chance to win the tournament, but he couldn't seal the deal. He got to the final, Death came through the lower bracket, beating Fatality himself, and then twice was able to beat Lakerman in the final and take the title. An absolutely shocking result, and quite frankly, Death never really delivered on the same kind of form ever again. He was just a shocking play out of nowhere. No one in the West had obviously played against him. Again, though, you had Power with a strong finish, yet again in 4th place, losing to Lexa and Death. You had Lexa emerge internationally, obviously a future great player. In this case, he finished in 4th place, beat Power, lost to Lakerman and Power actually in the lower bracket. Pele finished in 6th place. The hype for these Russian players had been legit, and that first CPL Europe Cologne was not a one-off whatsoever. And obviously in Team Deathmatch, they were showing they had really high skill level. At the Russian CPL London qualifier, you had, which were, by the way, in terms of duel, was a unofficial tournament because the finals in London was actually a TDM event, but the Russians just loved having duel tournaments. Lexa surprisingly won, again, showing that this guy was like one of the future top players from Russia. Pulacity managed to finish 2nd. Pele was in 3rd, and Death was in 4th. Again, already kind of showing that like it wasn't that legit a result, if I'm being honest. Quakecon 2001 in North America took place. There were no Russians in attendance. They didn't have the sponsorship to go. There was no qualifier. It was just a tournament held by, obviously, id Software at Quakecon. This was won by 04, who at this point in time was the dominant top player. Fatality was in 2nd. Not actually that close to beating 04. And then Socrates, who will be mentioned later in the story, was in 4th, and CZM in 5th. So names that you'll know in terms of top American duel players. In December of that year, we had the World Cyber Games, the first real World Cyber Games. That was an Olympics of gaming held in Korea. Again, massive event with all these international qualifiers, loads of prize money. You get gold and silver and bronze medals, depending on your top 3 placings. And unlike the WCGC, it had Russian attendance. Lexa asserted the start of his time as the best Russian player at this time with an impressive win at the qualifier. Pele also qualified, but it was actually the unknown Kick, a guy you probably won't even know to this day, who made it over Pulacity, Death, Power, etc. The previously established top Russian players. Now, at the World Cyber Games itself, Lexa won the silver medal. He finished 2nd, and he had close games against 04 in both the upper bracket final and the grand final. Supposedly, he got a bit shook in the grand final and kind of like got out of his own head. 04, remember, was then the best player in the world. He was what Fatality had been in past years, and he was dominating all the tournaments he went to and beating everyone, including Fatality. So for the top Russian player to again show a close performance in form and almost beat the best NA player and the best player in the world showed that there was some real potential with these Russian players. Now, Kick actually, despite what I said earlier, shockingly took top 6. He was 5th to 6th, beating Prozac, one of the most skilled Swedish Quake players of all time. He beat Python, Australia's best player, someone that we knew. He beat Socrates, the guy who obviously later on would become one of the absolute best players from North America. Pele himself finished 7th, 8th. Not that great, but still we're seeing like 3 Russians in the top 8. So Russia was having more representation than any other country in top placings at these tournaments. Now, admittedly, there weren't NA tournaments yet, And obviously the US, in terms of European CPLs, only Fatality was going because the others didn't have the sponsorship nor the inclination to go over. And there was a lot of money actually still in North America for the first couple of years of Quake 3, just at their lands and competing domestically. And they weren't top pros. It wasn't esports in the same sense back then. Then, if you wanted to see what the TDM really meant, after the Formosa teasers of the past with the strong Eurocup performances, a Russian team just outright won a TDM tournament. They won CPL Cologne in May of 2002 with the Forza lineup, with Mike's famously showing an MVP god tier performance in this competition. Quakecon 2002 happened in August of 2002, and finally, we had Russians in attendance. Now, Quake Duel, unfortunately, was starting to die off. Esports had already shifted the previous year to Counter-Strike, which was the bigger game in terms of fans and player base around the world. And a number of the majors were dropping off and just disappearing entirely. But we still had QuakeCon and we still had World Cyber Games as big-time events. Now, Lexa won this event, despite drama over, again from memory, not signing up in time, because QuakeCon actually, people don't know this, it wasn't supposed to be a professional tournament. It wasn't supposed to be esports. It was a tournament that they would hold at QuakeCon and essentially a festival of Quake that id Software put on. And so they would just open sign-ups, and whoever signed up in time, like the top X, I don't know, 128 or whatever, got to be in the actual tournament. If you didn't sign up in time, you didn't get in. So Lexa initially didn't sign up in time. I assume he went there thinking you could just register as a pro or something. And he was lucky that I think someone either gave him their spot in the line or enough people didn't show for the actual tournament. Maybe even because they knew a top player is going to play, and I'm just a guy from Texas who like, I'm never going to win the tournament anyway, so let all these pros play. That's despite the fact, because id Software had money, that the first place of the tournament was $20,000. Now, interestingly, Lexa never actually had to face any big name pros. He never had to beat his rival 0-4 and best him to take this big title, mainly due to unknown American Dela shocking everyone. Actually, he was known as a TDM player, but in this tournament was having some 1v1 success, and later on, the next couple of years, became one of the top American duelers, upset most of the field. And so Lexa just cruised along versus the lower opponents and then just beat Dela twice. So Fatality was at this event, and he finished in third, and he'd actually come back to Quake 2. He'd actually come back to Quake 3 for this tournament. Like, he'd been off playing in Alien vs Predator, which he'd won at the end of 2001. He'd been playing in Return to Castle Wolfenstein, where he was playing with his team Clan Capital from Quake 3 TDM, but now they're in Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Unfortunately, though, Fatality finished third, because even though he'd beaten 0-4, best player in the world, in their grudge match, he then lost to Dela in the upper bracket semi-final and Dela in the lower bracket final, so he never got to actually face against Lexa and show us that epic matchup. A few months later, we had the second World Cyber Games 2002, and the Russian qualifier again threw up a bunch of new talents, producing them at a significantly more rapid rate than North America or Sweden, the original best regions and countries for Quake. US and Sweden, that is. Now, we had young Cooler, really young Cooler, win this qualifier. Death still managed to be relevant. He finished in second. Then we had another young player, this time one that you'd never even heard of, basically, called Unkind, finished third in the qualifier. The next generation of Russian Quake players was already here, and you notice there's no Lexa in that equivalent. Pele and Palacity were in fourth and fifth to sixth, not qualifying for the event. And again, there was no Lexa involved in this. At the actual final itself, Unkind, who hadn't even won the Russian qualifier, shocked the world by winning the gold medal. In doing so, he beat Dela, he beat Socrates, some of the best North American duelers. Cooler managed to finish 9th to 12th, not a particularly relevant result, but was embroiled in a huge drama, if you remember, where he beat 0-4 in the group and then threw a game against the Canadian Cuckoo to eliminate 0-4 and points, essentially, because 0-4 was the best player in the world, and did it in cocky fashion. But then in the bracket, Socrates beat him in the lower bracket to eliminate him, therefore ending the Cold War of NA versus Russia that like DJ Wheat and 0-4 and the rest of them had kind of hyped up a little bit. Cooler, interestingly, shockingly lost to the Spaniard Achilles, who many people later will know was later caught cheating, not in this tournament, but later on in Quake, in the upper bracket. And then Death himself only managed to finish top 12 also. He was 9th to 12th. Surprisingly, he lost to Ukraine's Chip, who wasn't a particularly relevant player. Ukraine wasn't a relevant country back then. And China's Rocket Boy, in a shocking result. Obviously, Rocket Boy is the player who years later famously won that match on the Great Wall of China in Doom 3 against Fatality and won like $150,000 from I'm going to say maybe ATI, I think it was. I think that was who was sponsoring him at the time. This was a big time match, and the whole point is anyone who could beat Fatality would win that money, and no one else had done it except Rocket Boy. Now, we had QLAN in April of the next year. Kula won the event. He was ahead of the best Swedes. He already was showing, like, that first World Cyber Games result, that was me off my game. This is me a little bit older, travelling internationally to Sweden, and I'm on my game right now. He was dominant at this tournament. At ESWC 2003, a lesser prize pool than the other big events, Quakecon, World Cyber Games, but a new major for Quake 3 Duel, and with this live setup, and like you would be in like a theatre setting where you had all seats and a stage, so where this component really brought forth, only World Cyber Games and really had that. Quakecon had a stage, but even then, who would attend? Just people who were at the BYOC, etc. Now, at this tournament, it was won by Kula in an impressive fashion. He beat 0-4 in the final and just toyed with him. And 0-4, remember, had previously been the best player in the world. Lexa managed to finish third and was a very strong player, and even played well against 0-4. Death was 9th to 12th. So again, strong participation, representation, and actual end results from the Russian players. Kula obviously went on to become the best Quake 3 dueler, but he was battled for with that title with 0-4, with CZM. He won the 2005 edition of ESWC Duel as well. Then in Quake 4, initially he was the best player, then he was one of the second best players, and then eventually he was probably just top 4, top 5 player when he lost his motivation. In Quake Live, he made his comeback, became a top 2 to 3 player. Unfortunately, he was kind of a Kong himself, could never quite get that championship off his back in terms of the big international ones. Famously lost that epic Quakecon 2010 final to Cypher, even though it's seemingly impossible. Lost the IEM World Championship finals to Rafa. He was always so close, and even though he won the IEM European finals in Season 5, he didn't play Cypher in the final, he played Avec, and it was Cypher that had always been his hard counter, so he never quite got the status as number 1, but he's still a very, very good player. And we're talking about a period like 7-8 years after he'd been a rising talent and eventually the best player in Quake 3. Then in Quake Champions, I mean, he's won in Quake Champions. He's still a relevant player now. So Kula just endures. This guy's an incredible guy. He's in 2020, still competing with the best in the world and sometimes winning. So Russians went from being this underground hype to instantly competitive with the best player in the world and massively represented in tournaments if they sent their players. Eventually, they had a number of winners of their own. They had Kula, Lexa, Unkind. They continued to the end of Quake Live to be very well represented. So many successful players in online play. You had the likes of Pavel, Evil, Agent, as well. These guys came up before Evil became a really good LAN player. I think part of the reason why Russia was so good in Quake was they had this LAN center culture back then. I think a mixture of bad internet, and obviously people didn't necessarily have the money to have a big PC at home and all that sort of setup, etc. And there wouldn't be any other people to play. It was all the LAN center culture. So I know famously it was said that Kula just like lived in his LAN center for the first few years, just practicing all the time. They had lots of LAN tournaments as a result, because when you have LAN center culture, you get lots of small tournaments, then you get bigger tournaments, then you get regional tournaments, and then you stack the players together, you have the prize money, you get the spectacle. So they had loads of LAN tournaments, even if sometimes it was for small prize money relative to the West. And this continued throughout iterations of Quake, hence these famous results where like Belarus's keeper, shockingly, who later became a CS player, beat Kula at one of those Aces tournaments. And Cypher always holding over Kula, except for like one time at those similar regional Russian tournaments. Even if Kula was the best player in the world, this is the point of emphasis to make, he would go domestic. So he'd beat all the like, Europeans, North American. He'd go domestically and he'd be losing to people he'd never even heard of in these domestic tournaments, or having super close games with guys who didn't go to the international tournaments, which really hinted at the raw potential of Russian Quake. Now, the fun thing was the style of Russian Quake. Obviously, eventually, we had very distinct styles, but in terms of hallmarks early on, it was very aggressive. You had strong lightning gun play. At the time, a lot of players, obviously in the West, focused on the rail. You had high skill, which you utilised with this aggression. Now, Kula, in that sense, was a little bit out of it, because he was more of like a Rafa to the Russian scene, because he was more of a thinking man's play. He didn't have the highest raw skills, and he just dominated you with his mind. So Russians initially were irrelevant in Quake. Eventually, they were immediately relevant. Then they were the best, and over the history of the game, they have to be one of the best Quake nations ever, especially in the duel format. This video was kindly supported by Pronogo, Whattathings, Spencer Green, Soliko, Dean Tanglis, Jack Hanna, Hades, Jensen Goh, the Puyallup Tribe, JDubs, Tobias Bernasconi, Alexander Rao, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you'd like to put a question to me in my monthly video AMA. Do you want teasers for my upcoming content? Or maybe to even take part in an online esports discussion with moi? Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today in the Patreon link in the description box below.